Israelis, and the Western world caught in the crossfire.
It's a conflict over land, it's a conflict over religion, and we're nowhere near a solution.
5 major clashes in 25 years, marked by surprise attacks, remarkable counters, and secret alliances. All in an endless fight for survival. Top military minds take you deep inside the story you only thought you knew.
The struggle between David and Goliath, a vicious civil war.
This was the epitome of blitzkrieg.
One loss means the end of the state of Israel.
Revealing the strategy, the weapons, the tactics. These are the bullet points you need to know. It's the showdown in the Middle East. May 15th, 1948. Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion declares Israel's independence, ending 25 years of British rule. The United Nations supports a plan to divide the territory into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Arabs reject the plan and reject Israel. Wasting no time, several Arab nations go on the offensive. As Ben-Gurion speaks, Egyptian aircraft bomb Tel Aviv, Israel's temporary capital.
It's literally the day of its modern birth. And you have 5 Arab states, along with Palestinians joining in as well, all of them attacking Israel with the intent of wiping Israel off of the map.
Their reason? The new Israel lies in the heart of the Holy Land of Palestine.
The Arab-Israeli conflict is essentially about Palestine, the ancestral home of 2 peoples, divided by race, ideology, and ultimately religion.
The Jews believe that the land of Israel is the land that was given to them by God, back at the beginning of their religion, back at the beginning of Judaism, the beginning of civilization itself. For the Arabs, this is the land that they have held since the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. Their feeling is that their descendants were there even before the first Jews arrived.
The onslaught is total. Egypt storms the south. Syria and Lebanon attack from the north. Iraq attacks from the east, and Transjordan heads for Jerusalem. Israel has but one choice: fight back or lose everything.
It's barely 3 years since the end of the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were exterminated, but this time around, they are determined that they will not go without a fight.
This is their refuge. This is their island. And they can't afford to lose. One loss means the end of the state of Israel.
The odds they're up against are incredible. Israel is surrounded on all sides. They have no artillery and no armor. Outmanned 60-1, they don't even have an official army.
The day Israel was born, its army came into being that day, and they took what they could get.
Jewish civilians, immigrants, and paramilitary fighters joined forces, clashing with their Arab neighbors in a series of attacks and counterattacks.
One of the first things that happens during the war is the 2 sides trying to drive out the other side's civilian population. And as in any civil war, these fights are ugly and they are vicious.
May 28th, the Arabs have Israel in their grips. The old city of Jerusalem falls to Jordan. Jewish settlements in Galilee and the Negev are surrounded. Yet surprisingly, even after 3 weeks of intense fighting, the Israelis hold on. June 11th, with heavy casualties and no major victories on either side, the UN calls for a truce. It's the break Israel needs.
the Israelis are able to sort out this big amateur force into something resembling a professional military. And they begin to plan operations to drive back each of the invading Arab armies.
A month later, the war reignites. This time it's Israel taking the offensive.
Their entire population under arms, it's fighting together for the continued existence of their state.
In 10 days, the Jews claimed Galilee and pushed the Arabs back from Tel Aviv. Only Jerusalem and the Negev remain out of their control. Jordan holds Jerusalem. Egypt, the Negev. Losing the Negev means losing their future. The Israelis focus on Egypt and fight for it.
Egypt is the largest Arab state with the largest army, the main threat to Israel. In the battle between these two countries, we would see play out again and again in the years to come.
The plan? Operation Horeb. Objectives: attack Egyptian strongpoints, cut off the Egyptian supply route, and force Egypt's surrender. Simply put, occupy the land, control the future. Israel sends 5 brigades and puts one of their most experienced fighters in charge, General Yigal Allon. As a teenager, Allon was a commander in Israel's underground army and a member of anti-insurgent special night squads. At age 23, he co-founded an elite strike force, the Palmach. Now a general at age 30, he's leading Israel's new army into the desert to claim the Negev. If they fail, Israel will lose everything. Operation Horeb begins. Rather than face the Egyptians head-on, Allon opts for a surprise attack.
The Egyptians are waiting for an attack on Azluj, and Allon knows that. What he wants to do is to try to figure out a way around the Azluj position and take the Egyptians from the rear, go right after the base of their position at Al-Auja.
Allon finds a way. Remarkably, it's buried underfoot. A secret Roman road that will allow the Israeli army to take Auja entirely by surprise.
Even though it is covered by centuries of dust and sand, the Israeli engineers clear the road to make it passable for the Israeli 8th Armored Brigade.
While Israel's 8th Armored Brigade sneaks down the old Roman road, Allon sends another west to create a distraction. The ruse works. While Egypt focuses on defending the west, Israel attacks in the east, catching them by surprise.
By catching the Egyptians by surprise, by hitting them at Al-Auja when they were expecting the main attack to come at Azluj, Allon completely unhinges their defenses.
The Egyptian army was always very large, but not a particularly advanced or skilled fighting force at this stage.
Lacking leadership and motivation, the Egyptians at Auja surrender in less than 1 day. General Allon now pushes his forces west. Within 2 weeks, his troops are poised to destroy what's left of the Egyptian army. Operation Horeb takes Israel from the brink of defeat to the edge of victory. Surrounded, the Egyptians declare they're willing to negotiate. Israel bows to international pressure and accepts. The War of Independence ends with a ceasefire.
It's not a peace treaty, it doesn't resolve the conflict, but it does set some boundaries that do remain in effect. And Israel, which was given about 55% of the land under the UN partition plan, now has 78% of the land.
The fragile peace redraws the map. Israel secures the Negev and expands their territory. Egypt holds the Gaza Strip. Jordan keeps the old city of Jerusalem and the West Bank.
At the end of its war for independence, Israel has achieved its most important goal. It is an independent state. It has survived. What they haven't done, though, is convince the Arab states to let them live in peace.
Israel wins the war for independence, but not security. Despite armistice agreements, none of the Arab countries agree to peace, and hundreds of thousands of homeless Palestinians are growing restless.
The best estimates are somewhere around 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes in what is now Israel.
Some of them left of their own free will. Some of them were driven out. Some of them left voluntarily with the promise that they'd be able to return on short notice. 60 years later, there are tens of thousands of Palestinians living in displacement camps, still awaiting their return to their homes.
With so many hostile neighbors, training the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, becomes top priority. In 1953, they find the right man for the job. New Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan.
He is a born leader with tremendous charisma. He wants soldiers who can think and fight and act aggressively. And it's under Dayan's leadership and his vision that many of Israel's most important elite formations are first born.
One of those elite formations is the 202nd Paratroop Brigade, led by General Ariel Sharon. The 202nd Brigade must go from concept to operational fast. Israel is facing three mounting threats. Militant Palestinians known as the Fedayeen attack Jewish civilians. Egypt blocks an Israeli trade route. And a new leader starts flexing his muscles, Egyptian President Gamal Nasser.
Egypt's monarchy was overthrown, and some young officers took power. Foremost among them was Gamal Nasser. President Nasser sees himself as a leader of all the Arabs, not just of Egypt.
Nasser boldly calls for Arab unity and death to imperialism.
He's wildly popular, and the message that he's sending out is the Middle East should be evacuated by the colonial powers, and this artificial entity called Israel needs to be brought to an end.
Nasser takes ownership of the shortest shipping route between Europe and Asia, the Suez Canal. It's all part of a daring move to oust the West from the Middle East.
The Suez Canal was built by the British and still held by the British. Nasser wants to nationalize the canal both because he wants the revenue from the canal to support Egypt's economic and military development, but also because he wants to get rid of the British.
Nationalizing the Suez has another effect. Israel's trade access to the entire world is severed. To resolve the crisis, Israel turns to one of the few nations with the power to intervene, the United States.
The U.S. wants to maintain good relations with the Arabs and with Israel, and it doesn't really want to pick sides in this conflict.
France and Britain, on the other hand, do want to fight. Covertly, they enlist Israel to join them.
The British, the French, the Israelis all had one thing in common. They all hated and feared Gamal Abdel Nasser and his Egypt.
Skirting international law, the three nations agree to work together in secret. Israel will make a play for the Suez Canal. Britain and France will pretend to stop them, seize control of the canal, and overthrow Nasser.
Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. If you saw it in a movie, you would throw your popcorn at the screen.
For its part, Israel must capture key positions, cut off supply routes, and encircle the enemy. Codename Operation Kadesh. Phase 1 for Israel is critical. To avoid rousing Egypt's army, they designed the attack to appear as a raid and not a full-scale invasion.
They have to create a threat to Suez, but they also want to do it in such a way that they don't completely commit themselves to the operation if the British and French betray them. And so they come up with the idea that they will drop a parachute battalion at the entrance to the Mitla Pass and seize it.
As the only road through the mountains, Mitla Pass is key. Control the pass. Control all movement of troops and weapons. To seize it and keep a low profile, the 202nd Brigade makes a plan to split up. Battalion 890 will drop into the pass 45 miles from the canal. The rest, under General Sharon, will travel 65 miles to Mitla by land from Jordan's border. If Britain and France back out, Israel will abort the mission with minimum loss. Operation Kadesh begins. 7 a.m., Sharon starts his trek. 5 p.m., Battalion 890 travels to Mitla Pass for the first and only combat drop in IDF history. As darkness falls, 395 paratroopers jump from the sky. But as they hit the ground, Israel's secret plan quickly unravels. The paratroopers are 3 miles off course, and half of Sharon's convoy is lost to desert sand, slowing his progress, leaving Israel's top battalion deep in enemy territory with no backup, and no guarantee Britain and France will hold up their end of the plan to intervene. Israel's secret plan to seize the Mitla Pass is off to a rocky start. Half the 202nd Paratroop Brigade is off course, and the other half is behind schedule. But the brigade's decision to split up and stay small works in their favor. Egypt hesitates to take action. General Ariel Sharon and his troops forge ahead to Mitla, and the IDF takes several strongholds with little interference. Now it's up to Britain and France to live up to their end of the bargain. October 30th, Britain issues the planned ultimatum. Israel and Egypt must stop fighting, and both sides must withdraw 10 miles from the canal within 12 hours or face war. It's an ultimatum the Egyptians reject, choosing instead to dig in for a fight.
They send several infantry brigades to try to push the Israeli paratroopers out of the Mitla Pass, and several armor formations to try to reinforce their infantry holding the forward defenses in Sinai.
Israel's 202nd Paratroop Brigade reunites in the Mitla Pass. Under heavy enemy fire, their infantry training pays off. After 7 hours of hand-to-hand combat, the bloodiest battle in the Sinai campaign, Israel gains full control of the pass.
What the Israelis learn is that the Egyptians are not cowards, they're not pushovers. But over the course of several days of combat, small Israeli formations are able to outflank Egyptian positions and get into their rear. The entire Egyptian defense of Sinai begins to come apart.
In retaliation, Egyptian President Nasser sinks all ships in the canal, cutting off his enemy's supply line. But Israel cannot be stopped. In just 100 hours, IDF troops conquer most of the Sinai, including the Gaza Strip and the coast of the Red Sea. 10 miles from the canal, they stop short to let their allies take over. Britain and France capture Port Said and prepare to advance on Suez City. The plot is on track to succeed, until the world's two great superpowers step in to break up the action.
There are very few things during the Cold War that bring the United States and the Soviet Union onto the same side of an argument. This is one of them. The U.S. and the USSR both view the 1956 Suez War as an egregious violation of the laws of sovereignty, a premeditated invasion of another country by 3 states that had very little justification for moving forward.
Militarily, the Israelis and the British and the French were doing exactly what they wanted to do. But with the United States intervening and ultimately voting with the Soviet Union for a resolution that called for a ceasefire, it was the diplomacy that really brought an end to this.
The Suez Crisis is over. France and Britain failed to capture the Suez or overthrow Nasser. Israel conquers the Sinai, but the UN forces it to withdraw. The result: Egypt holds the Sinai and the Suez, wins favor with the international community, and secures a strong ally in the Soviet Union.
Gamal Abdel Nasser, he then becomes one who turns away an Anglo-French Israeli invasion, and his popularity in the Arab world explodes.
Nasser celebrates his victory, but Israel scores 2 advantages. The U.S. guarantees their right of passage in the Straits of Tiran, and the UN establishes an emergency force on the Israel-Egypt border.
The Israelis at least got something out of it from their perspective. The threat of an Egyptian attack was reduced somewhat, made them feel at least a bit safer when it came to Egypt.
The sense of safety doesn't last long. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees are still homeless. To call attention to their cause, they formed the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO.
The stated aim of the PLO was always to reclaim the lands lost in the War of Independence of 1948. And to do this, they determined that the State of Israel had to be eliminated, by fair means or foul.
The PLO and Arab countries pressure President Nasser to take further action. He responds, ordering the UN troops to withdraw, and for the second time, blocks Israel from the Straits of Tiran. The pressure builds. May 30th, Jordan's King Hussein signs a defense pact with Egypt. Soon after, Arab troops begin mobilizing on all of Israel's borders. All signs point to war once again.
Israel's getting very, very nervous. It feels that war is coming. They do not want to be on the defensive because that could be fatal for this small country that needs to be agile and quick and nimble.
The Israeli military is very concerned that if they allow the Egyptians to land the first blow, it is likely to be a much longer fight, a much harder fight, a much bloodier fight, and ultimately a much more uncertain one.
Israel shocks everybody by deciding to act preemptively.
The Israeli Air Force already has a plan, one they've been perfecting for years. For it to work, Israel must strike first, without the enemy's knowledge, and strike decisively. Codename, Operation Focus.
Israel faced several adversaries, so the goal was to attack Egypt on the ground and knock out the Egyptian Air Force first, and then go after the Syrians, Jordanians, and Iraqis.
Israel chooses the perfect weapon, the Dassault Mirage 3CJ fighter.
Mirage 3C was delta-wing, single-engine airplane. It was fast, it was maneuverable, and the Israelis made sure it was armed with two 30mm French cannon. And it had good range, and it could be used both as an interceptor and as a ground attack.
With 72 brand new French aircraft, Israel is ready to take on the enemy. Now they must choose the right moment.
The Egyptians would normally take off at dawn, and they would go fly a patrol mission, to protect their airspace. Then they would come back and land, refuel, have breakfast, and then go to routine operations.
Israel times it perfectly. 7:10 a.m. 16 Israeli jets head for Egypt. 7:14 a.m. 183 more airplanes join them. In 30 minutes, 95% of Israel's Air Force will swoop down upon Egypt's airfields, just as the Egyptian pilots sit down to breakfast. 8:45 a.m., day one of the six-day war. Israel launches a surprise attack on Egyptian airfields. Visibility is excellent. In 3- and 4-plane formations, the Israelis dive in their superior Mirage fighters. bombs disable the runways. 30mm cannons strafe and destroy all aircraft. The Israeli fighters strike 9 Egyptian air bases 3 times, all in 20 minutes.
The Israeli strike really exceeds their expectations. This is almost a decisive blow. It certainly sets the tone for the war.
The Egyptian Air Force loses almost 300 planes at a rate of 2 per minute. When Arab allies try to intervene, Israel strikes airfields in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria.
Within 6 hours, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 50% of the Egyptian Air Force, 66% of the Syrian Air Force, 25% of the Iraqi Air Force, and 100% of the Jordanian Air Force.
Operation Focus is a complete success. In one day, Israel destroys most of their enemy's air force while losing 19, just 13% of their own. Israel owns the sky. Now the Israel Defense Forces send in 3 tank divisions to take the Sinai from the ground.
They mount attacks on 3 key axes in the Sinai Peninsula. First, they got to crack the frontline defenses, and then they want to get to the canal fast.
Leading Israel's armored corps is the man who helped develop it, General Israel Tal. While IDF tanks push across the desert, IDF paratroopers go after an ancient objective, the old city of Jerusalem.
Since the 48 war, Israel has the western part of Jerusalem, and Jordan and the Arabs have the eastern part of Jerusalem. And the eastern part includes all of the most important religious sites. Jews haven't been able to pray there for almost 2 decades.
10 a.m. Israeli troops take back Old Jerusalem, including the sacred ruins of a Jewish temple known as the Western Wall.
The Kotel, which is what we know as the Wailing Wall, is absolutely fundamental to their religion, and its capture was the acme of the Six-Day War.
The historic capital and the historic religious spot, and by recapturing it from the Jordanians, it was a moment of intense pride for Israel.
In less than 72 hours, both the Jordanian and Egyptian armies are in full retreat.
The Egyptian army quite quickly starts to fall apart, and at one point really begins to panic and sort of retreat pell-mell, just dashing, trying to make it back across to the western side of the Suez Canal because the Israelis are advancing so quickly.
To catch them on the run, Israeli tanks block the Mitla Pass, corralling the Egyptian army.
They were trapped in a bottleneck, and they were bombarded by Israeli Air Force fighter bombers for hours and hours on end, and the massacre was appalling.
The devastation forces Egypt to accept a UN ceasefire, but Israel won't stop. Israel attacks Syria and threatens to go all the way to Cairo and Damascus. The shock waves from Israel's blitz strike even further.
The Russians are terrified that Egypt, Syria are going to be overwhelmed. And so they very quickly begin to make threatening noises that causes the United States to realize that this war could get very much out of hand.
Under pressure from the superpowers, Israel ends all hostilities. Their six-day war is a shocking triumph.
In 6 days, Israel has won one of the most overwhelming victories in modern military history.
With victories in Sinai, Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, Israel triples its territory. The only thing they don't win is what they want most: peace. So Israel offers to barter. They'll surrender nearly all of the land if the Arabs agree to peace treaties. The Arabs are in no mood to negotiate.
For the Arab world, The Six-Day War was a disaster. Indeed, it was known as Al-Naqsa, which is Arabic for disaster.
The Arab League convenes in Khartoum, and there they adopt what is called the policy of the three no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel.
Egypt wants revenge. Though 80% of his army was destroyed in the war, President Nasser vows to keep fighting. He turns to a nation with the means and muscle to back his objective, the Soviet Union. The Soviets give Nasser the best they've got to take on the Israelis in the air, the MiG-21 supersonic jet fighter.
MiG-21 is a lightweight fighter developed by the Soviet Union to intercept bombers. It was fast, it was maneuverable, it was agile, it was armed with a cannon, and in some flight regimes, the superior aircraft was the MiG-21 over the Mirage 3 at higher altitudes in dogfights.
The Soviets also provide a ground weapon that can blast Israeli planes out of the sky. SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs.
SAM-2 had a central radar with 6 launchers around the outside that were large missiles that would go up to about 80,000 feet. They were relatively slow to launch, but above about 2,000 feet, they were very lethal.
Israel counters Egypt with a 100-mile wall of defense along the Suez known as the Bar-Lev Line, and turns to the only power that can match the Soviets, the United States.
The U.S. government started supplying advanced fighter aircraft to them. The A-4 Skyhawk, that was a very good lightweight strike aircraft and was ideal for close air support and bombing targets along the Suez Canal. So you had a situation like a chess game where really powerful forces were fighting along the Suez Canal with the newest equipment that both superpowers were supplying.
The war of attrition officially begins. Nasser's opening move, a blast of heavy artillery. In 1 minute, more than 10,000 shells hit the Bar-Lev line at a rate of 175 rounds per second. The pounding stuns Israel and continues off and on for months.
It's becoming awkward for the Israelis. They don't want to provoke a crisis with the superpower. But by the same token, they're not willing to allow the Soviets to continue to creep forward, to push Egypt's defenses out further and further, to make them thicker and thicker and harder for the Israelis to attack.
Israel knows it has to do more and calls in their air force for the first major operation since the Six-Day War. The plan: ambush Egypt from the air, take out their anti-aircraft weapons, and force a ceasefire. Codename Operation Boxer.
The goal of Operation Boxer was to create an opening, a hole in the Egyptian fortifications along the Suez Canal so that the air power could get in and strike back effectively.
2 p.m. Israel's Air Force locks in on military targets in the northern sector of the canal. Egypt never sees them coming. The Israelis drop 200 tons of explosives on Egyptian artillery in less than 3 hours. The mission proves to be a small victory. By day's end, the Egyptian Air Force regroups, spoiling for a fight. 60 of Egypt's Soviet fighters and bombers streak toward the eastern bank of the canal. Israel sends their top fighter jets to meet them. It will be their biggest showdown yet. Over the east coast of the Suez, Israeli pilots down 3 MiGs. Egypt strikes back, downing 2 Mirages. From the ground, Israeli anti-aircraft artillery take down another MiG and an Su-7. On day 1 of Operation Boxer, Egypt loses 5 planes, Israel 2. Over the next 8 days, Israel's Air Force flies 500 similar missions. It's only the beginning.
From then on, the Israeli Air Force flew almost on a daily basis to strike targets along the Suez Canal.
Over the next year, dogfights and bombing missions intensified, inflicting heavy damage on both sides.
Israel kept pounding and pounding, but they started losing airplanes. And I mean, they were losing 4 or 5 airplanes a week. Both sides were suffering, and both sides brokered a ceasefire in the summer of 1970.
The war of attrition ends in a stalemate. After 3 years of fighting, little has changed. Israel maintains the Sinai. Neither side commits to peace negotiations, nor does either side fully commit to the ceasefire. Rather than withdraw, President Nasser moves dozens of SAMs even closer to the canal and Israel's Bar-Lev line. But he never has a chance to strike again. In September 1970, he dies of a heart attack. New Egyptian President Anwar Sadat attempts to recapture territory lost to Israel in the Six-Day War. His diplomatic efforts fail.
He actually floats a peace plan to Israel, but the Israelis reject it. They're not interested. They still believe that they can hold on to Sinai.
Sadat tries to force a settlement with Israel by threatening war.
He goes to his generals and says to them, in effect, it is clear that the Israelis, they believe that they can continue to hold our territory and not pay a price for doing so, and we're going to have to convince them otherwise.
October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel's holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur.
For the first time, Arab armies are coordinating their operations. They create a war on 2 fronts. They are facing Egyptian forces and Syrian forces, more powerful, more competent than any they've ever faced.
In Sinai, the Egyptian attack is devastating. 240 Egyptian aircraft bomb Israeli fortifications as 80,000 soldiers cross the canal on the offensive. For the first time, Israel is facing a major defeat. October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack. Israel finds it difficult to fight back. With over 100 SAMs in the canal zone, Egypt has created a deadly umbrella of defense, 20 miles wide, 100 miles long, and 50,000 feet high. For Israel, it's virtually impenetrable. On the first day, they lose 40 planes to anti-aircraft artillery.
It was obvious that air power was not going to work as it had before.
The IDF must turn to a different weapon, the Centurion tank, or as the Israelis call it, the Scourge. Its power lies in its latest upgrade, the high-power 105mm cannon, capable of firing armor-piercing ammunition.
Essentially, all the tanks in frontline service with the Israeli army were armed with this 105mm gun. These were absolutely devastating against armor, normal combat ranges out to and above 2,000 meters.
Despite their firepower, Israel's tanks are falling quickly. In the Sinai, Israel loses more than half their tanks in less than 2 days. On the northern front, the situation is even worse.
One of the most ferocious battles of the entire 1973 conflict is up in the northern sector of the Golan Heights.
After 2 days of fighting, Israel's 7th Tank Brigade collapses from 105 tanks to 7. Syria is about to overrun Israel and take back the Golan Heights. But then, a game changer. Reserve soldier Major Yossi Ben Hanan arrives with a small team of Israeli reinforcements, including 13 fresh tanks.
He had returned from honeymoon in Tibet on hearing of the outbreak of war, and he rushed back to Israel.
Ben Hanan hits the Syrians in the flank, bringing the final Syrian offensive to a halt.
Hanan's brigade buys time for the arrival of more Israeli reinforcements. Within 2 days, Syria loses over 600 tanks to anti-tank fire, mines, and trenches, and begins to pull back. It's a victory that also turns the tide for Israel in the south.
The Assyrians pleaded with the Egyptians to say, come out of your defensive positions and please push into the Sinai and take some of the pressure off our front.
As Egypt moves out from under its SAM umbrella, Israel prepares to strike. Their plan: attack Egypt's reinforcements, cross the Suez, and occupy enemy territory. Code name: Operation Gazelle. Over 800 Egyptian tanks advanced beyond the Bar-Lev line to the Sinai. 700 Israeli tanks and anti-tank missiles are waiting for them.
Israeli armored forces and air forces destroy the Egyptian formations piecemeal, and they send the Egyptians reeling back to their lines with the loss of 25 to 30% of their forces.
After a decisive victory, General Ariel Sharon secures a corridor across the Suez.
He takes his division and they find a seam between two Egyptian armies.
They cross the canal, they tear up the Egyptian SAM batteries on the west side of the canal, they encircle Egypt's Third Army, creating an existential crisis for Sadat. He has only one choice. He has got to get the Soviets to step in and create a crisis.
October 24th, Israeli troops are within 60 miles of Cairo and striking distance of Damascus. The Soviets raise the stakes, threatening to send troops to intervene.
The Soviets alert several of their airborne divisions for immediate deployment to Egypt, which suddenly gets the attention of the United States.
October 25th, noon. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger announces a plan to revisit Arab-Israeli negotiations. The goal: sovereignty for the Arabs and security for the Israelis. 1 hour later, Egypt and Israel agreed to end the Yom Kippur War. For the first time, both sides enter into negotiations and treat each other as equals. In 1979, Egypt and Israel sign a historic peace treaty ending 30 years of war.
This is the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. Huge, huge breakthrough.
Camp David Accords were a big deal. And as Henry Kissinger once famously said, the Arabs cannot go to war without Egypt. And they have not done so since then.
The wider conflict, however, still rages.
Israel has made peace with Egypt.